I want to speak directly to Creative Assembly for a moment, because I think it's important to understand what's happening right now. CA, listen to your audience. Truly listen, because if you had already, you would have certainly avoided what's happening with Pharaoh. Be willing to adapt and change. And again, truly listen to feedback. Because the players, the hundreds of thousands if not millions of people who play your games, who literally dedicate their free time to not just play, but add on to and develop your games for you through mods, are who matter here. And finally, if I hadn't said it before, listen to your audience. The same audience that for more than a decade has called for a return to depth, to every little gameplay detail that make up what used to be the quintessential Total War experience. And listen when they beg for a full decade and more for a new engine, because you have sucked on the teeth of a disjointed and subpar foundation for longer than you should have. And people have noticed ever since the first ever iteration of it with Empire. For 15 whole years you have not listened. Not truly. And despite so many people loving your games despite their flaws, including myself, who's created an entire channel largely dedicated to your games by the way, there comes a time when enough is enough. And when even a decent product is just not enough to make up for a decade of continued disappointment in key areas. Areas which I personally have pointed out time and time again, but which others have also made clear in one way or another since 2009. So please, for your sake and the players, listen to us. Take our feedback. Open the lines of communication with us through dev diaries and developer interactions, and become the company we know you have the passion and talent to be. And listen to what games the players say they want, because most of us have been screaming for very specific titles and features that have yet to be seen in the past decade or more. So how did we really end up here? This is bad, horrible even, and I say this as a person who sees Pharaoh's merits and who wants the series to succeed, but not despite everything. Total War Pharaoh launched just last week after what must have been the worst lead up to a Total War game ever, even worse than Troy since that did after all release on Epic first, and probably had a few dozen thousand players playing in the first few days. But Pharaoh? Well, not so much. And in its first week has only reached a peak of 5,500 players. I don't want to mince words here, so that is just absolutely damning for CA, especially because this was supposed to be the grand historical return, but for a game which really didn't feel like it. For some actual history though, War Thunder is the deepest vehicle-focused wargame ever made, and offers combined armed warfare in awesome PvP battles, with a total of more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships. It's all based on real-life models for ultimate immersion, and is free on both PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. Whether you prefer more action or proper tactical experiences, War Thunder offers various levels of simulation, and with a deep customization experience for all vehicles, including camouflage and equipment, War Thunder deepens further. Play it all in 4K with amazing graphics and experience actual pinpointed damage values, where you deal and take damage based on where you're hit. I love War Thunder's dedication to history and simulation here, both in the audio-visual details of these awesome explosions, but also the vehicle models themselves. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox now using my link below, and if you are a new player or returning after more than 6 months, claim the large bonus pack by using my link, which includes multiple premium vehicles, premium account, an exclusive 3D decorator for your vehicles, and much more. Thank you so much to Gaijin for sponsoring this video. I mean, let's compare numbers right off the bat here. Total War Pharaoh's highest concurrent player count sits at about 5,000. That is lower than Napoleon at almost 10,000, Rome Remastered at 18,000, and the Empire at 27,000. I want to give you some context to these numbers. These are games from 13, 2/19, and 14 years ago respectively. And what usually happens, if you have a successful series, which Total War certainly is and has been, is that these numbers go up with every game, since hopefully your player base and fame have increased. This is actually the trend we see in general if we go by fully mainline Total War titles as well. But notice what happens here. Rome 2 reaches an all-time peak of 118,000 players. The only titles to compare with Rome 2 are Warhammer 1 with 113, Three Kingdoms with 192, and Warhammer 3 with 166,000 players at their peak. These are numbers that Creative Assembly should be wanting to see reached or even surpassed with each new Total War release. But as we see, Pharaoh doesn't even reach these giants to their knees. The painful truth is that this even goes when seen side by side with Rome 2, which came out 10 years ago, when Rome 2 sports an average daily player base peak of about 8,000 players even in the year of our Lord 2023. And Attila, which was brutally left to crumble back in 2016, but is kept alive because of its amazing base game and fantastic modding scene, still keeps more than 3,000 players coming back every day. And don't get me started on Medieval 2, dear old aching but still walking Medieval 2, still keeping an average peak of more than 5,500 people, literally more than Pharaoh's all-time peak. And this is not even keeping in mind that most people probably bought Medieval 2 on disc back in 2006. This just highlights my argument that the past 10 years of Total War has been a lost decade of core growth for this series. Because the truth is that the core audience of Total War, I would argue, is different than those for Three Kingdoms and Warhammer 3, the two games with a notable increase over Rome 2's peak. And this is why. Pharaoh was coined on being a return to the historical side of things, of reinvigorating the franchise for the actual core audience, and to bring history back to the series. Now with core audience, what I mean is essentially the fanbase that was here before Warhammer and Three Kingdoms. And this is not a distinction I make out of spite, nor with any malice in mind. What I mean is specifically the player base that is not just the good weather fans that are here because they love Warhammer, before they loved Total War, or the newly arrived Chinese audience that came with Three Kingdoms, but rather the audience that followed the series for up to 23 years and who will come back if CA actually put out a game made with them in mind. But the truth is of course that Pharaoh, while historical, is not made with the historical core player base in mind first. In fact, I personally don't know who it was made for first, but I can tell you what it was made on, and that is a broken foundation, an engine which on its own seems impregnable to any meaningful change and improvement, and further was actually never meant to be a full game on its own, but very likely meant to be a saga title. In other words, a side project that acts more like a support pillar to the franchise than a core beam. While I myself promised to wait until I'd play the game to actually put out meaningful content on Pharaoh, others could report soon after their very early play sessions that Pharaoh did indeed remind them much more of Troy than they wanted it to. And Troy is of course widely regarded as sporting perhaps the worst iteration of the Warscape combat engine ever, and I say that as a person who finds Troy's campaign full of charm. Now my review was critical of Pharaoh, but a lot of my criticism is nowhere near being unique to Pharaoh, and putting my personal biases aside for a second, I can confidently say that Pharaoh is in fact a good game. It can be thoroughly enjoyed by fans of the time period or by players who don't mind the current mechanics of Total War. It's just not a good historically grounded Total War game in my eyes. It's not a game for me. And as is evident, it's not a game that people like me will embrace, specifically because the biases and preferences of the core Total War audience, an audience which for the past 10 years or more have been feeling very left behind. And it didn't even begin with Rome 2 10 years ago, but with Empire, a game that while expansive and ambitious actually began the simplification of the series in a number of ways. There is no justifying Pharaoh's low player count. Creative Assembly chose to market this game as their next main historical Total War game, and as such, players expected a mainline title's worth of content. As we see, Total War players love mainline games that actually seem and play like mainline games. Each mainline Total War title beginning with Empire, which I choose to begin with, since this was when Creative Assembly tied the Total War games to Steam for the very first time, has amassed more than 20,000 concurrent players at or around launch, some of them a vast amount more as we've seen. But even Thrones of Britannia, a saga title, which at the time of release harkened back to a historical setting, managed to carve out a decent number at almost 23,000, more than 4 times that of Pharaoh 6 years later, at a time when the Total War community is literally starved for true historical content. But sadly, it's just so evident that this is not it. Pharaoh just isn't that grand new historical game, and even though I can't independently verify this, it's becoming more and more clear that Pharaoh was pretty much thrown under the bus because of CA's troubles with hyenas, now an utterly failed game that lost the company $100 million of upfront investments and years of invested labor. The death of hyenas is a tragedy for Creative Assembly, but for Total War players like me, so was that game's greenlighting in the first place. Since when thinking of this number, $100 million, I'm imagining the Total War games we could have had instead. Indeed, I bet we could have had both a Medieval 2 remaster, an Empire remaster, and an Attila fix to boot with change to spare if they had chosen to invest in their core audience instead. And as such, Pharaoh was tossed under the bus because it was probably never intended to be a full historical title in the first place. Because it feels, plays, and looks a whole lot like a saga game, like a side adventure, a fact which has been pointed out by every Total War player and their mother ever since the game was first revealed 5 months ago or so. What Pharaoh is a reimagining of Troy's foundation, set in Egypt and the Levant. It's neither more nor less, with variations in unique mechanics and a few minor additions that may or may not stand the test of time. But that's it. And as repeated by so many before and after me, Pharaoh as a mainline Total War title needed to have included at least Mesopotamia, but perhaps also Greece, to have felt like a full Bronze Age Total War game. And indeed, Bronze Age Total War would have been a title which in itself would have signaled an era and region-defining game, rather than Pharaoh, which assumes a much more local experience. What's so groundbreaking with Pharaoh though, is not just that it's doing poorly, but actually that it's doing poorly in itself. And what I mean by that is that it truly shows the power of this community, because the utter tragedy of the Total War series is that the players are so utterly here for more Total War. It's proven in the continued high player counts of Rome 2 and the combined numbers of the other historical Total War games, which, again, are old by now and seem like half a lifetime ago, but dedicated players continue to flock to them. For such a niche genre, and for games which, let's be frank here, have an utterly garbage multiplayer offering in terms of purely offering 1v1 campaigns and not even simultaneous turns before Warhammer 3, is frankly amazing. It shows how much these players love your game's Creative Assembly and how ready they are for that new experience that brings more of that soul back. But sadly, the fact is that Creative Assembly has not once in the past 15 years, certainly not on a fundamental level, fully managed to listen to its community and change course. And I say this with conviction. Empire was the herald of what was to come, and even then players quickly identified the shortcomings. Compared to Medieval 2, features were lacking, and as we know, it shipped without the massively important features it was supposed to have. Napoleon patched up and improved on Empire, but added virtually nothing of substance. Shogun 2 went back to include more features again, but the core fundamental of freedom of buildings was never again implemented, and in my opinion, Shogun 2 was overall not really an improvement of the concept of Total War, but a standstill, and very much took advantage of its era. Rome 2 went further in moving away from what the original audience loved about the series, and so it has continued ever since, despite Attila being the outlier here in actually adding features that were fundamentally good. But in the grand scheme of things, Total War actually never managed to truly surpass Rome and Medieval 2 in terms of experienced depth. Sure, later games may technically have more mechanics to play around with, but they don't necessarily make the game more fun, deep, or memorable. And this fact was proven by none other than Rome Remastered, the remake of their very own genre-defining game, which still is so much fun to play, and I am convinced that Creative Assembly tripped on their own feet here by not implementing a multiplayer campaign for this remaster. What baffles me about this entire down-spiraling saga is that it seems Creative Assembly never truly had a plan, never truly understood what to do with the vast wealth they created with the Warhammer series. Despite me not personally wanting this series, there's no denying it's done incredibly well for them, and is likely to be their best performing titles ever, especially when considering the massive DLCs tagged on. We see the exact same thing with Three Kingdoms, a game that did so well, sold so many copies, and actually vastly outdid every other Total War game in terms of peak player counts, and which was expanded upon with DLCs for 2 years and probably made them a hefty amount of cash as well. Now, if I were CA and came in after the fact of these massive successes, and understanding that there is probably a limit to the Warhammer player base, because we have a deal with Games Workshop for 3 titles, that it probably is time, and probably already was time by 2017, to begin working on a full, massive historical title to rally my main Total War core audience. Especially in 2023, I would have completely reimagined our approach to community interaction and set up regular dev diaries where our developers could take time out of their day to interact with select posts from community members and invest in moderators to weed out potentially non-constructive comments for a safe and secure society. I would have imagined that after more than a decade of begging, that the players would have enjoyed a Medieval 3 the most, perhaps followed by an Empire 2, and put my newfound war chest into building the deepest and most encompassing historical Total War experience imaginable, and play to the strengths I knew the core audience wanted, and learn my lessons from what they had explicitly told the company that they didn't want to see return from Empire and after. In fact, I would have not just looked at what I could have learned from the past 2 decades of our own series to understand what to improve on for the future, but I would have looked beyond our own niche. I would have looked to Paradox and seen that part of what makes those games absolutely thrive over years and years, despite being so complex, is twofold. Namely, a continued and dedicated system of free and paid support for up to literally more than a decade for the same game, but also a dedication to multiplayer. For even though the main Total War experience has and will always be single player, it is so easy to innovate enough for the multiplayer scene to become a true game changer. Invest in dedicated servers and open up the multiplayer campaign lobby and make every playable faction playable by humans at the same time. In fact, if I were a cynical man, I would have looked to what Age of Empires was doing extremely successfully, might I add, and made the simple and extremely cost-effective choice of going back to literally developing definitive edition versions for Medieval 2 or even Empire Total War, polishing it with Napoleon's refinements, and then literally just make new DLC for it that someday would have implemented every cut piece of content that was meant for the base game. And yes, even implementing a fully functional multiplayer campaign with more than just 2 sweaty concurrent players. As a historical Total War player myself, I know I would have absolutely paid for DLCs and expansions that made an Empire Remastered the game we all wanted to be in the first place, without the immediate massive cost of making an all-new Empire 2. In the end, Total War players, at least core audience members like me, who's been with the series for literally more than half a lifetime, want nothing more than to want to toss money at CA if given the chance, i.e. if presented with a Total War title we've asked for. The baffling part is of course that, at least for me, I haven't truly wanted any of the past Total War titles since Attila, which is literally 8 years ago now. And that is, frankly, downright depressing. And it remains baffling and completely alien to me why Creative Assembly seems to consistently fail to understand its audience to such a deep degree that in 2023, after a 7-year consecutive reign of Warhammer, that it blundered not just with community statements and massively failed investments, but that where it matters most, namely historical Total War games, that the series had its most crushing defeat yet, and it needs to be learned from. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this rant, and know that whether you're just a regular old Total War Joe like me, or a Creative Assembly developer, that I only mean well. I want this series to win, I want it to be the best it can be, and I want it yesterday. So please, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And then you can get right back to playing War Thunder, which actually feels like an exciting historical simulator. Remember to sign up and play now for multiple premium vehicles, premium account, an exclusive 3D decorator and much more, and experience these historical battlefields in all their glory. So download and play War Thunder on PC, Xbox, and PlayStation for free right now. Thank you so much for watching, thank you so much to Gaijin for sponsoring this video, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!